Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for joining us today. I thank you for your efforts, and I want to begin by saying that, as my colleagues have said previous to this, I see this process as being a constructive process, a process to make sure we learn the things that have gone on, to make sure that things that happen in the future, make sure that these things that have happened are prevented. I had the opportunity a couple of weeks ago to travel to the Gulf to visit with some folks down there, to fly over the area from Moss Point, Mississippi to Cameron, Louisiana, and really understand what was going on. And I had a couple of concerns that I saw, and one is I was really moved by the frustration with people in the area, whether it's fishermen or citizens. Secondly was looking at the process there seemed to be a disjointedness to it, a lack of coordination. And I know that there's an oil response plan. I know that local governments, state governments, federal governments get together and go through an exercise to look at that, whether it's a tabletop exercise or the completeness of that exercise, I think is something that needs to be looked at. I know there's an incident command there looking at making sure that things are coordinated, but it did seem like to me that where oil began to appear, there wasn't a timeliness in making sure that the response was there. There was also, I think, some frustration with the local fishermen there as to including them in the process. And it seemed like to me that the whole idea of adaptively managing to these crises wasn't part of this process of looking at how do we put together a response plan. I mean, you know, a spill is a pretty dynamic event, and making sure that we have the ability to adaptively manage, I think, is as critical as having a plan that looks at all the different scenarios. One element that was very compelling to me is I know the use of dispersants was a critical element of this. And we all know what happens with dispersants. It breaks the oil up into smaller particles, and then it stays, instead of coming to the surface, it stays suspended in the water column or eventually goes to the bottom. One of my questions is there an element in the whole planning process that takes into account the suspension of oil in the water column and what we would have to do to respond to that? Because I hope it doesn't turn out to be an out-of-sight, out-of-mind scenario to say, well, as long as it's not on the surface, as long as it doesn't wash up on the beach, then everything is okay. You know, I think the impact of that suspended oil, especially dropping to the bottom, is as detrimental, if not more so, than what may wash up on the beach. So I was wondering if you could tell us maybe where the planning stands with suspended oil or oil that makes its way to the bottom, and how that is incorporated into the planning process and the response scenarios.
So, Congressman Wittman, on the question of the dispersants and oil that may go to the bottom or will be suspended in the water column, Lisa Jackson, the administrator of EPA, has probably spent half of her time in the Gulf from the beginning of this incident. She is very much on top of that, working alongside with the Department of Commerce and NOAA, and they're looking at that. Indeed, they will have the third meeting. We've had scientists that have been helping us from the beginning, including looking at how the well can best be shut off, to other issues. And there is a meeting that is planned where the best scientists in the country will come together to look precisely at that issue. So we're very much working on it. On your first observation relative to frustration, it is a reality that there is frustration out there, but I can tell you that there is a huge amount of effort to try to address those specific frustrations. Secretary Napolitano and I, along with 6 members of the U.S. Senate, were in Fort Pushan day before yesterday, meeting with the oyster and commercial fishermen and others. And what we will do under the commander's authority, Thad Allen, is to do everything that we can to make sure that people who are concerned, whose livelihoods are at risk, who feel concerned about what will happen with their long-term livelihood, that their concerns are addressed.
Very good. And one last comment. I think the whole concept of adaptive management in these sort of crises is critical. And I bring together an example. I was talking with some oystermen there, and they said, we have an area of oysters that has not been impacted yet by the spill. And clearly that's the case. They said, we would like to be able to have the flexibility to go in there and harvest those oysters so we can take advantage of that resource. And then if the spill comes in, we would agree that the area should be closed. But to have in the planning process, the planning scenarios, the response scenarios, the ability for some adaptive management. And I realize that there are requirements in place for closures and those kinds of things. But it seems like to me in the planning scenarios that there has to be the idea of being able to adaptively manage, to say, listen, during these scenarios, let's go ahead and put the bureaucratic hurdles in the background and say, let's give people the power to make timely, thoughtful decisions in how these responses come about. I think that's critical, and I think that's one of the elements that sometimes is missing in giving people confidence in the decision-making elements there on the government side. And it goes back to whether it's opening oyster grounds or sand berms or those kinds of things. Timeliness in decision-making, in being able to make decisions on the run, responsible decisions, but make decisions on the run in these scenarios is critical. And I certainly hope that that becomes part of the learning process that we go through in this, as we evaluate how this is unfolded, or this scenario is unfolded in the Gulf.
Congressman Wittman, I would only say that Admiral Thad Allen, as the serving until I think yesterday as the Commandant of the Coast Guard, is probably the most experienced person in the country in terms of responding to these kinds of crises. We are on the phone with him every day. The Deputy Secretary David Hayes, the White House, and I get an update on everything that's going on, and when problems are discovered, we take action to address them, and we'll continue to do that. And part of it is, as you describe, being able to make quick and responsible decisions that would fall within the rubric of what I think you describe correctly as adaptive management.
Gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes.